maybe we'll start with you on this one. Penny Mordaunt has spoken out. I think ignore Penny Mordaunt at your peril, don't you? She's a woman who needs to be reckoned with, and she also knows her onions in this particular game, doesn't she? She knows just what she's talking about.
Well, of course, she was in the reserves,
Yes.
so she had a lot to do with the Navy, and she represents what I describe as a naval seat, really, down in Portsmouth. So, yes, she knows a lot about the Navy and has had a lot of contact with the Navy as well.
And so what she's saying is more investment needed, more resources, more money. And really, I suppose she's also saying, the Navy needs to be taken notice of, its importance, and it's the fact that it's absolutely vital to our defences needs to be underlined and emphasised.
Well, I mean, we are a maritime nation, and that seems to be forgotten sometimes. We're also an island, and there are all these statistics get rolled out about 97% of the trade by volume comes in by sea, and the fact we still run global shipping from London, etc., etc., etc. But people seem to pay no attention to it. I mean, the sea is frightfully important to our nation. It's the reason we survived 2 world wars. Let's face it, if we hadn't had a navy, we wouldn't have done. And we forget it at our peril, and we seem to have forgotten this over the last few years. Now, all of defence has been squeezed, but since 2010, the military has been cut by a third. I don't believe people realise when the coalition did their cuts in 2010, it was cutting the military by a third. And naval manpower, for example, was reduced. I spoke in the House in about 2011, 2012, saying, if you don't bump manpower up, there'll be a problem downstream. And I was checking the other day, because I knew I was talking to you again. I've spoken 37 times since 2011, saying that we have too few frigates and we need to start building and ordering them rapidly. This is going back 10 years ago, because otherwise, when we needed them, they wouldn't be there. These things take time. And we're now there, and we haven't got them. And the number of ships we were promised, the government promised they would never go below 19. We've now gone down to 17. We're about to go down to 16, and so on. And that is not enough to do what our nation, I think, expects of the Navy.
I mean, I did an item on the programme on Friday with an eminent military man and various other defence experts, and they were saying in tones of deepest seriousness and real urgency that they are absolutely certain that a war is inevitable relatively soon. I mean, they didn't say, by Friday, but they said within the next X years, it would be astounding were war not to break out. They gave all sorts of reasons why. And I wonder whether you share that view. Do you feel that we've been able to forget the importance of our maritime power because we're complacent and don't believe there will be a war?
I think we have been complacent. I have to say that I've been on the active list in the Navy now for 56 years. And in that 56 years, this is the most dangerous and unpredictable time that I've ever come across. During the Cold War, yes, there was the risk of nuclear annihilation, but it was actually quite stable, and we were able to talk with the Soviet Union and this sort of thing. Now things are popping up here, there, and everywhere, and I think it is extremely dangerous. And because it was stable, and then there were various changes, because there'd been no fighting, it was easier for the government not to put money into defence. They said the right words, but you only look at Hansard when I was taken to task. It was platitudes. They weren't actually doing anything. They didn't make the orders. They didn't do things. Now they've got to get going. And the danger always is, it's all very well saying, well, we're going to get some ships by 2035. We might have been at war twice by then. Now, I hope we don't end up in a war, but people like Putin look at other countries and they say, how serious are they about actually stopping wars? And part of the seriousness is in terms of defense capability. We saw it in the Falklands when we decided to get rid of endurance to save £16 million, and Galtieri thought, they're not interested in fighting down here. And then there was a war which ended up costing us, in the money in those days, £6 billion and several hundred people killed.
Yeah.
That is what happens when you don't spend money on defence.
Do you think that, Jerome Starkey, that the sabre rattling that obviously needs to occur to say, wake up, take notice, look at the Red Sea, look what's going on in Ukraine, for God's sake, look at China, look at the volatility in the whole of the Middle East, which could spread very quickly, look at Iran, just look, for goodness sake, wake up. This is no kind of postponable matter. This is imminent happening. Do you think that we're somehow sleepwalking into this and nobody's taking it with any real degree of seriousness?
Well, Vanessa, I think it's really interesting. I mean, Admiral Lord West, is absolutely right. He's been making this point as loud as he can for as long as he can. What's really interesting is that we've got people like the Defence Secretary saying similar things now. Grant Shapps, saying that Britain could be facing theatres but conflicts in North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia within the next 5 years. Of course, Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron saying similar things, that the world is as dangerous as it's been. And yet there's a gap, it seems, between their rhetoric and the reality in terms of how they are resourcing the armed forces. Grant Shapps saying, of course, it remains his intention to increase British defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, but he can't say when. PM Rishi Sunak can't say when. If the world is getting more dangerous, then these warnings need to be taken more seriously. And I think there is credence to the message, which if you want to avoid a war, you have to be ready for a war. And that's in many ways what Lord West was saying, that if you're seen to be not serious, not credible, if you're not resourcing your armed forces to defend your nation, then you become a target of opportunity for those who might wish us harm.
Lord West, you talked about the Cold War, and you said that the fear was just nuclear destruction, obviously, but you said it was possible to talk to the Russians. There was some kind of dialogue going on. If you envisage, and I'm sure you don't want to, but if you do envisage a war now, how do you envisage the war shaping up? Do you envisage a kind of nuclear annihilation, or is it a completely different picture now?
Well, I think the danger was, depends obviously who the war's with, and there are so many things going on all around the world. Let's take one little example, Venezuela threatening Guyana. Well, I think we have a responsibility for Guyana, as do the Americans and other countries. So you could end up possibly having to fight to defend part of Guyanan territory. Or it might be what we're doing now, we're actually doing something against the Houthis to protect innocent trade in the Red Sea. If we're saying that we're likely to be having a war with Russia, that would mean it was a NATO war. And if there's a NATO war with Russia, and the danger always is that once you start fighting, you lose control of things. And there are mistakes made by people, and these mistakes can lead to something worse and something worse. And there is always the risk when you're in that position that it could lead to a nuclear exchange. Putin had his doctrine was one of, he said, of stability and de-escalation. The way he was going to do it was if he started losing a conventional war with NATO, he'd fire a nuclear weapon, one nuclear weapon, to show we've got to stop this. Well, he hasn't looked at NATO doctrine, because if someone fires a nuclear weapon at NATO, they get one back. And that is extremely dangerous once you get to that sort of position. And we're not able to talk on a rational basis with Putin in the same way as in the Cold War. We were able to talk from our centers of power in the UK and in America direct to the Soviet leader and say, look, hang on, let's de-escalate this. Now, we were able to do that with Putin when he started. During 9/11, for example, the Americans started upping their readiness of their nuclear weapons, because it happens automatically when something like an attack like that happens. And they were able to phone the Soviets and say, look, don't worry, this is nothing to do with you. We're not aiming at you. And Putin said, understood, we're actually putting ours on a lower level of readiness. That would not happen today, I'm afraid. Putin has changed, and we don't have that linkage.
And I just wonder, Jerome, whether you've alerted readers of The Sun to potential issues in Venezuela and Guyana. Do they know about that? Should we be worrying about that?
It's a good question, Vanessa.
Yeah.
I think we will certainly look at it. I don't think it hasn't been in the newspaper yet, but it's the newspaper at the moment is crowded with stories, and with defence stories, and particularly about the Royal Navy and about concerns over the Royal Navy losing ships. And it's interesting, we've talked about attaching resources to defence, but the problem which the politicians seem unable to solve, and which perhaps may be more one for the services themselves to solve, is one of recruitment.
Yes.
And so the Navy is potentially looking at losing 4 ships in the coming months, 2 frigates and 2 amphibious assault ships, in large part because it doesn't have the manpower, the crew to run them. Now, that's a twofold problem. It's partly because, as Admiral Lord West pointed out, all 3 services have been whittled down in terms of resources. Their headcounts have been reduced, but it's also actually on a sort of day-to-day level at the moment, because more people are leaving than are joining, and that is despite the best efforts of the Army, the Air Force and the Royal Navy.